Hello and welcome to the Fire Protection Association's Assembly Point podcast. I'm Jonathan O'Neill, I'm Managing Director at the FPA, and today I'm joined by Dorian Lawrence, Managing Director at Façade Remedial Consultants, and Stephen Howard, Head of our Fire Testing and Experimental Unit here at the FPA. Thank you both for taking the time to join me today to discuss the impact of the recent changes in legislation and guidance on making buildings safer, and of course what we still need to see is how effectively to assess and manage risk. So, in the immediate aftermath of Grenfell, the FPA investigated the 8414 testing process for the fire performance of external cladding systems. And we recommended some changes to the standard, most of which sadly were not taken up by BSI in their review. Nevertheless, we've now got 4 rigs to carry out UCAS accredited testing here at Morton in Marsh, and we've invested in the material identification laboratory so that we can identify the type of insulation material used on a building and in cladding systems that we test. Dorian, I know that you have been very interested in material identification right from the very start, certainly post-Grenfell. What role do you think these tests will have to play in the building safety crisis and assessing safety?
Yes, great question. With regards to the 8414 test, it is a shame that your recommendations weren't taken up. We'd actually like to see it changed as well to incorporate a window into the test rig, especially with the changes in the PAS and the Fire Safety Act, the PAS 9980. We think it's essential that windows are incorporated to reflect the real life effect of a fire when it happens. It's very rare that a fire occurs on a sheer wall with no windows, so we'd like to see some changes. With regards to materials testing, especially with the risk-based guidance that's been brought in under the FRAEW and the PAS 9980, essential that we fully understand the materials that are on site, because we all know what's contained in the as-built or the operation and maintenance manuals probably isn't correct in a lot of instances, so we have to make sure those materials installed on site are the correct materials. We've done over 3,000 reports on various different buildings, and what we found is in the region of sort of 80% of buildings over 18 metres do have quite a serious issue with those materials. So essential that we assess the correct material in the correct location. So yes, essential that you're ready for the amount of testing work that's going to be coming up, especially as we now drop down to the 11 to 18 metre category with 88,000 buildings in that sector.
Steve, obviously you've got a big history in 8414 testing. Interested in your thoughts, and particularly how this capability will be best developed to ensure building safety going forwards.
Well, it's an interesting question. The majority of the products that are used in the built environment were sat under System 3 as part of the CPR, and I assume that they will move forward in that way in the UK CA mark. And this actually means that once the products are tested and have been tested once, there's no further ongoing checks. Now, I do actually believe it's critical that given manufacturers and where we're at post-Grenfell, that there is additional assurance that the products that are tested, especially at large scale, or even from sort of like SBI and small flame tests, that there are some underlying guarantees that the products that are tested are the ones that are placed on the market. And I think there's a lot of work to do on this area to move forward. If a specifier requires any validation that a product is the same as that tested, there's very little options in the market at present. The issues that you have is for small-scale testing is a complete repeat of the test programme to get a full classification to prove that a product still is at the same reaction to fire level that it was when tested. There's massive issues over lab capacity in the UK. The time and cost of doing that is just not possible for the test labs currently to keep up. The other issue that you've got is when you go up to large scale testing like 8414, if that is not repeatable on a batch by batch basis, that cannot be done. And as I said, the only checks that are currently in place for the product are basically those at the outset during the test. If a validation method of proving product identity was included at test time, I think that would give an enormous reassurance to the market.
Absolutely. Now, moving on, so in January 2022, we saw the withdrawal of the Consolidated Advice Note, the previous guidance on external wall safety. We saw the publication of PAS 9980, the Code of Practice. What impact do you think this has had, and do you think the government should be doing more in terms of guidance or clarification to the interpretation of building regulations? Dorian, what's your view?
Well, the CAN only applies retrospectively. We would describe the CAN as quite a blunt instrument that was used. I think it's mentioned over 7 or 8 times. Remove any combustible material on buildings of any residential buildings of any height. You've got to remember that replaced Advice Notes 1 to 22 in 2018-19. The CAN came out in 2020 and was retired in 2022. So that was quite a blunt instrument, and it just said take the materials off. With regards to the materials that we were looking at, it would possibly be able to leave some combustible material on site in rare instances. So it just didn't cover everything in the detail that was needed. With regards to the building regulations and the explanation of building regulations, yes, there needs to be a clear and concise process with guidance from the government about that. So we've got further changes in building regulations in December 2022 coming out this year. No ACM on any building, so not just residential. It does give a calorific value. We've got no combustibles over 11 metres and no combustibles to attachments. So it'd be really good to have a clear process set out by the government and perhaps some workshops and some explanation on there. It's not just building regs where education is needed, and it's key that we think about the volume of change post-Grenfell that there's been. We've had multiple changes to building regs since Grenfell. We've then had Advice Notes 1 to 22, followed by the Consolidated Advice Note. Amidst all of this, we've had the EWS1 form, versions 1, 2 and 3 different versions over 4 years. We've then had the funding element. We've had the ACM fund. We've had the £400 million ACM fund for housing association blocks. We've then had further funding with the 1 billion, the latest 4.5 billion, and then a new fund that is shortly to be announced for the 11 to 18. They are all different. All of that funding process is different. Bring into that the Fire Safety Act with the PAS 9980, then the Developers Pledge, and then the Building Safety Act. There is a raft of guidance and legislation that needs clear explanation from the government and how it all works and fits together. It is very confusing. So what we've done is put together a CPD that we offer to all of our customers and bodies to help them try and pick their way through this complex and confusing situation that we're in. But it's still a very fluid situation. We still don't know the final version of the Building Safety Act with all the appendices. We still don't know, the Developers Pledge still isn't signed. The new fund for 11 to 18 metres hasn't been announced. And we only had 2.5-3 weeks ago the guidance come out on the 4.5 billion. So we're still right in the middle of trying to work out the best way forward and which blocks fall into which categories. So we do need some clear and concise guidance on it, including regulations, building regulations.
Well, if that answer has made it any clearer to our listeners, they're in a better place than I am. I must admit, it does sound exceptionally confusing. Steve, I know it's not directly related to testing, but I appreciate you've had some experience in this area. Is there anything that you would like to add?
I've had very limited experience at PAS 9980, but all I can say is from my experience, that was an approach that fire engineers were using in the round to assess building products prior to the issuing of an EWS1 form. PAS 9980 does add a lot more detail and a lot more depth to the process. And I think it is actually a welcome addition to assessing external walls construction and the risks associated with those, especially if you have legacy buildings and buildings where you have combustible insulation installed. The thing I would be interested in is, are there any sort of like third-party certification schemes that currently directly address the PAS and assessing competence? There's a lot in the PAS that would require a lot of information from fire engineers and consultancy practices that they are competent to undertake that and meet all the recommendations within the PAS.
The third-party certification is interesting. As you know, I'm a strong believer in third-party certification. I believe it should be a regulatory requirement for all fire safety services and products, including fire risk assessments. Certainly the installation and maintainers of fire protection equipment, sprinklers, fire doors, fire alarms, etc., all should be third-party certificated, in my view. And to me, that's an important aspect that's missing from the Fire Safety Act. Of course, we've had numerous calls for the government to mandate independent third-party certification for risk assessors as a minimum. But given your background, Steve, and some of the things you were just talking about third-party certification, do you think it would be feasible to have a third-party certification scheme that covered the design and installation of facades?
Yes, I think it would be entirely possible. I don't think it's particularly straightforward and would need a bit of a multidisciplinary approach. I mean, if you are going to issue a third-party certification on a facade, then you'd be needing to consider not only the fire elements, but also things like wind loading and water ingress of the facade. And I don't, that is technically very challenging, I think, under the current circumstances. A third-party scheme would also need to be sort of like beneficial and meaningful for others operating in the trade as well, and insurers, stakeholders and other people that have an interest. If a third-party scheme was to be run, it would need to sort of like reduce costs and improve safety and improve traceability of the facade and materials that are going on, and allow others who are currently undertaking extensive amounts of checking to potentially reduce their involvement. The other comment I'd like to make about third-party certification schemes, on most of the ones that I've been involved in, there's no insurance backing beyond sort of like liability insurance. The penalties involved with transgressions in the scheme usually just result in exclusion from the scheme by the particular companies. Now, I think a third-party certification scheme backed by insurance that potentially could get directly involved in the remediation of a facade if should it go wrong could potentially change the third-party certification market in the UK.
You could potentially change the government's view on mandatory third-party certification as well.
Possible.
Dorian, obviously this is your bread and butter. What's your view?
With regards to accreditations, yes, third-party accreditation is essential. The PAS 9980 does give some guidance on the qualifications needed for each area, but it would be great to see accreditation that binds everything together. So for the reporting side on the PAS, a very busy sector for us, all correctly qualified, all correctly insured. But it would be nice to have a complete third-party accreditation for that. We know that the RICS have done it with the EWS1 course that they've put together, and that's worked well to bring in additional resource. CITB Level 3 Diploma for installation has been brought in some time ago, but that's that's under review currently at the moment, but trying to cope with the volume of work that we've got ahead of us in the UK is going to be quite difficult to get everyone up to the right level of accreditation and skill set, because it's not just the qualification, it's the experience that runs in tandem with that. But we would welcome third-party accreditation for any complete process It's quite obvious there are some people in the marketplace that aren't correctly qualified to do this type of reporting and this type of work. So yes, it's much welcome.
Clear message there. I think welcome is third-party certification, but put an insurance-backed scheme, and we could be in a different place. Through the horrors of Grenfell, we've seen that if a risk assessment doesn't look at the entire building structure, it can lead to serious problems. And an important change introduced by the Fire Safety Act is that the fire risk assessments look at the entire building, and secondly, external assessment is part of that. From you, Dorian, from your experience and your perspective, what difference will that make?
It's essential that we look at the complete building holistically. We see all different types of and qualities of Type 1 fire risk assessments. Remembering now under the Fire Safety Act, the Type 1 fire risk assessment is the trigger then to look at. So in that fire risk assessment, it would say, for example, if you have cladding on the building, therefore you would need an FRA EW, a fire risk appraisal of the external wall. And if in that Type 1 it said that there were concerns or suspicions that the compartmentation isn't correct, then you would need to look at that, but also incorporate that into your PAS 9980 report. I like the PAS format because it looks at facade materials, facade complexity, and then fire strategy measures. So it looks at each one of those silos, giving it a positive, neutral, and negative risk. Works out very well so that you cover all of those elements. It will make the building safer. We will be able to find out exactly what the risks are, looking at the holistic building. We've done quite a few peer reviews where the reports are undertaken in accordance with the Consolidated Advice Note. Now they're done under the PAS, where we can look at all of the elements of the building, for example, sprinkler systems, good compartmentation internally, and so on. It sometimes is possible to change the rating on the building, looking at every factor that would influence the safety. It's good that the RICS and the BSI have confirmed that they're both married up with regards to the scope that they cover and that they're the same. So at the end of every PAS 9980 report, we now produce an EWS1 form. We've seen a dramatic rise in PAS reports since they've become mandatory under the FRA EW with the Fire Safety Act. The Consolidated Advice Note wasn't mandatory. It was only there for guidance. Now it's an act of law under the Fire Safety Act, a massive rise in the volume of business, but also with regards to Type 2 and Type 4 fire risk assessments, because it's essential that you have that information to understand how the building will behave in the event of a fire. Internally, how the flames will spread. There was a fire in East London recently. 4th and 5th floor cladding caught fire, but the smoke got to the 18th floor internally. So quite an issue. So that compartmentation wise is key. It will only drive to make buildings safer, to gather all of that information and understand the exact risk that is presented.
Absolutely. You just wonder, you talked about buildings with good compartmentation and sprinklers. I wondered if you could outline how many of these great buildings are actually out there, because my suspicion is we're going to see more with the compartmentation problems and no sensible fire protection.
Armour did a study. So we sit on the Armour Building Safety Group, which is now the Property Institute. And they did a study on internal issues compared to external issues. And the average cost of an external cladding project calculated at about 2.1 million across the portfolio that they looked at. The internal issues were calculated at about 2.4 million, but that was in most of the buildings that were reviewed. So internal compartmentation is as big an issue as the external facade. We do a lot of PAS reports and a lot of internal Type 2 and Type 4 intrusive fire risk assessments. It is a colossal issue, understanding how the building is compartmented. You're going to need that for the Building Safety Act, for the information, for your building assurance certificate, but you're also going to need it under the developer's pledge to ensure that the developers put the work right themselves internally as well as externally. So there's a lot of issues out there, as I'm sure you can understand, that are covered up. Once they're covered up, you just can't see them. Type 1 fire risk assessment would pick issues with compartmentation up, for example, in a riser cupboard where perhaps fibre had been installed and the compartmentation hadn't been made good. Then further investigations would be undertaken to check the rest of the building.
Very interesting, and probably as I suspected. Now, it's taken 5 years following Grenfell for us to start the process of changing with the Building Safety Bill. As you mentioned, passing into law is now the Building Safety Act in April of this year. Looking at the Act in detail, it's intended to create a lasting generational change to the way that high-risk and residential buildings are constructed and maintained, something we touched on with your previous answer. Dorian, I wonder whether you think the Act will really achieve this, or is it just going to be pie in the sky? Are we going to ever get the buildings regulated the way we need to, inspected the way we need to, remediated in the way we need to?
I think that's a really massive question to answer in the time that we've got. Let's break it down into new buildings. So new buildings moving forward, much easier to control now, the construction, the design. I like the Building Safety Act Gateway 1, 2 and 3. So at planning stage, having a fire statement. At the design stage, making sure that complies with building regs, and then at construction phase, making sure that the works have been installed as the design. So really like that process for new builds moving forwards. Yes, I think it is possible over a pretty quick period of time. Reintroduce the Clerk of Works to the whole construction process. Remember, construction works in the UK haven't really been checked for 45 years. You can tell me whatever systems contractors have had in place, but with the work that we've seen, they've not been properly checked for circa 40 to 50 years. So new builds moving forwards, yes, achievable, definitely. When we look at this, it's applying to retrospectively to get a building assurance certificate. So you're going to have to gather all of the information. Now, when we get handed a building, we don't get an awful lot of information. So think about all of that detail that you've got to get for the building assurance certificate. So you'd have to do a building safety case. You need your plans, your elevations, your specifications, your testing regimes, all of the compartmentation details, fire door survey, structural and condition survey is now required, the O&M manuals, and all the building regulation 38 information. That is a colossal amount of information to gather for a building of 18 metres or 7 stories, whichever comes first. The cost to do that is between £20,000 and £40,000. Then you have to put the safety case together and the safety case report, then get the building assurance certificate. So quite difficult to get all of that information. Now the timeline that's been set out is April 23 to register, October 23 to submit the case, and then the BSR, the Building Safety Regulator, will start to check it in April 24. So quite a difficult task to get done. However, the Building Safety Regulator has said for existing stock, it could take up to 5 years to get round to checking the safety case. So that's a massive task for them on circa 13,000 buildings to check the safety case has been done properly. We're currently gathering all of that information on a lot of blocks and putting that together with our building safety manager role, trying to get it into a format that's presentable for a safety case. But it's a process. It's a long, drawn-out process, just trying to get the information and get all that data. And if you can imagine, doing a compartmentation survey on a 30-storey building isn't a 10-minute job. You know, it's quite a process. So yes, possible on new builds, definitely. A very long process to get it done on existing buildings. I think it's a bit hopeful, really. I do think it's achievable, but it's going to be a long time before all existing buildings are, one, got a building safety case complete that's been checked by the Building Safety Regulator, and two, making sure that all those works have been undertaken to the correct standard to make sure that the building is completely safe.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what capacity the building safety regulator has to actually look at these safety cases when they eventually start coming through, because I suspect, like the rest of the industry, they'll struggle to find enough suitably qualified people to be able to look at them. But I could be wrong.
We had heard that there was a bit of an issue with that, but we are working with the HSE and a large managing agent at the moment, producing a safety case on a building as a trial to see how long everything takes and how the process actually evolves. So it's going to be an interesting 5 years. Yeah, definitely.
And that would be 10 years after Grenfell. Shame, isn't it?
Agree, 100%.
So the introduction of these two acts has been one thing, but of course, as I say, it's been not only be a decade until we actually get this stuff sorted from Grenfell. It's a decade, more than a decade, since we had the last building safety review of building regulations. Surely that has a large role to play in building safety moving forward, particularly when we consider how building methods have evolved, particularly in recent years. Given the fast-moving pace of construction innovation and the pressures on sustainability, do you think that the current approved document B approach will ever catch up with evolving building methods? And do we need a completely new system to ensure compliance with building safety standards? Steve, interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. From my experience, from an ADB point of view, I think it's largely guidance and performance-based guidance. So I think from that angle, the ADB approach could potentially work. There have been issues raised around ADB and interpretation at the Grenfell public inquiry, and I acknowledge that. But I think as a method, I think it has merit because it's performance-based. From a testing point of view, I would question whether we're actually spending enough money on determining how best to assess buildings and testing methods and the research to underpin that. I think the current standardisation process from Europe and even in the UK takes far too long. We're not keeping up with innovation. Standards can take years, if not decades, to produce, and the construction industry, as many of the other industries, are moving on rapidly. I personally don't have an answer to this because when you generate a standard, there's a lot of input from various different interested parties. But I will just say again, I don't currently think we're spending enough on methods and methodologies to actually how we assess buildings outside of the way we currently do it.
Dorian, you're involved again at the coalface here. Are we spending enough on testing and are the current building regulations fit for purpose?
I don't think the current building regulations as they stand are fit for purpose when you read the advisory sections, because it doesn't work. Because when we look at buildings and we enter into discussions with various different parties, the advisory sections do cause an issue. However, if we look at the mandatory section of the building regulations, which has been in since 1984, since the introduction of the Building Act, B41 says no height, which there is no height restriction on. So forget the 11, forget the 18, forget all of that. It says the external walls of the building shall adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls and from one building to another, having regard to the height, use and position of the building. Now, the wording from the judge at Grenfell said it didn't meet it. It didn't adequately resist the spread of flame. The wording in the Hyde housing case recently with Mullally's didn't meet building regs, didn't meet B41. We've got the fire service writing on various projects under 18 metres, 4 stories high, saying the building doesn't meet B41, remove the cladding. So I think if everyone had worked to B41, we wouldn't be in the position that we're in. The problem that we have is how do we prove compliance with B41? So if an 8414 test was a little bit more robust and reflected what happens in the real world when there's a building in a fire with a window, with a door, perhaps a balcony, we could use that as a method to compliance. Changing methods of construction and sustainability do cause an issue. Photovoltaic panels are normally Euro Class E so it's worth considering. We should start to look at buildings with them on, whether they're on the wall or on the roof. They do cause an issue. Car charging as well does cause, electric car charging does cause an issue. There are fires with car chargers. So we need to think about all of these other elements as it changes. So how do we make sure that we comply with B41? Is really the question, whether that's performance-based, as Stephen said, or whether it is an outright, you've got to have some form of test just to prove that you comply with B41. Very difficult for regs to keep up in that process, but there does need to be a change in the way that it's looked at.
Do you think that Steve, I'm interested in your views on this, whether building regulators and the Fire and Rescue Service as an enforcing authority have enough knowledge of fire testing and what the implications of the various test reports mean as far as their impact on the fire safety of a building is concerned?
No, I think in some areas the regulators and others are fully aware of what's in the reports, understand the reports, can interpret correctly. I think there's a number of areas, notably on the reaction to fire side, European classification and the implications of that a better understanding of the workings of those standards and the European classification process would benefit the industry and benefit the construction industry generally. I have found over the last few years that the reaction to fire elements of construction and materials is not as well understood as fire resistance disciplines.
Maybe that in itself is a subject for a future webinar.
Possibly.
Right, one final question to you both, if I may. One thing that I think both our organisations are aligned and have in common is our mission to make buildings safer. What else do you think is needed, either from the industry or the government, to make this happen to prevent further devastating fires like the one we saw at Grenfell Tower? Dorian.
First of all, on the high-risk buildings, and I know high risk isn't always over 18 metres, depending on usage as well, and location. My suggestion is, and I have made this suggestion at several panel meetings that I sit on, that gather all the data for the over 18s. Let's do a risk register of them. There's 2,000 circa buildings going through the Building Safety Fund. Let's focus on those high-risk blocks first of all and get those remediated. We've got to remember there's only so much resource that's qualified, competent and experienced to rectify these blocks. Do the same process for the 11 to 18s, but that's a massive task. That's 88,000 blocks. How many of those that have defects we don't know. I would have thought it's at least half. The other thing that will speed the process of remediation up will be to sort the funding issue out. To be fair to Michael Gove, we tried really hard to sort out this funding issue, but it does get very complicated and confusing when you look at all of the different funds that we've mentioned previously, whether that's ACM, whether that's the 1 billion or the 4.5 billion that's just been announced, and another fund that's coming. It's great that the government are behind it and coming up with the funding. Now we have into the mix the developers' pledge, where they're saying they'll put right their defects. But you need to sort the scope out between the Fire Safety Act and the Building Safety Bill. Is it the same scope that's necessary? The Fire Safety Act works to PAS, however, the Building Safety Bill works to a safety case and compliance with building regulations. Two completely different standards. We could see the scenario where developers pledge, developer puts it right to the PAS standard, but that still might not get a building assurance certificate. So more confusion. So we need proper funding sorted quickly. We've got 88 blocks waiting to start that are subject to funding, either under the developer's pledge or under the 1 million Building Safety Fund. They're sort of sat in between at the moment. Get that scope sorted. Get an extension to the Waking Watch Fund so that more alarm systems can be installed to reduce cost of Waking Watch, because we know they're still out there, they're still costing an awful lot of money. Some buildings we deal with are £40,000 a month on Waking Watch. We developed the alarm system with the FPA to assist in that process. more pace is needed for the existing buildings to get on with it, and also set up some sort of mental health assistance for the poor lessees that have been caught up in this absolute nightmare for the last sort of 4 or 5 years. It's an absolute travesty, really, the mess that the system is in. But pace is needed, clear and concise guidance to funding and how that's attainable. Do what they did in Australia. Government paid for the lot, then asked the developers to pay it all back. That's sort of happening at the moment, but we're still in a very much a liquid state. Moving forward to the smaller blocks, 11 to 18 metres, get those checked quickly to make sure that they are safe. Because 18 metres still could be 6 stories, 17.7 metres, 6 stories. Those need to be checked quickly to make sure that they are safe, and then introduce some form of funding for them. So all happening, but just not quick enough, unfortunately. But we do see some good progress with regards to developers stepping in, saying that they'll pay for the works and rectify it. So I'm really pleased with the progress the industry has made from that side. But yes, lots can be done with regulations, making it clearer and more concise moving forward to make sure our new stock is compliant, and then working with the Building Safety Act is going to be, we need to try and simplify that where possible. So lots of change coming. And yes, lots of things the government could do to assist and make it work.
Steve, from your perspective, is there anything that could be done to make things better?
Yes, I believe so. I mean, I have limited experience on site visits, but one of the things that was notable to me is almost every building is unique, and whilst we don't want a uniform built environment and we want variation and whatever else, that most of the building aesthetics and things like that and the functionality would not be impacted by better standardisation. I've also got first-hand experience of the same mistakes, from my experience, just seem to be repeated over and over again. You're going out on site and there's dampers are not smoke control dampers, or fire dampers are not installed correctly. Insufficient room has been given for services passing through basements. Attachments at locations where you require cavity barriers and things of that nature. And it's that sort of element that I think we could vastly improve upon. Coming up with a more standardised construction method that means you go into a building and into building control and to the building safety regulator in the future with a standardised accepted details. From my experience, buildings just vary hugely, and the issues that you get with them are reflected in that variability. There seems to be a lot of work going on, or a lot of remedial work going on, to which I would have thought could be addressed at the design stage.
Interesting thoughts. Well, we've come to the end of our discussion today. For me, it's been fascinating. Thanks again, both, for joining me.